In our second series of How to Fix Democracy, we're focusing on the relationship between democracy and capitalism. It's a two-way relationship, of course. Capitalism affects democracy as much as democracy affects capitalism. Rebecca Henderson teaches capitalism and business at the Harvard Business School, and she's the author of an important new book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. Rebecca, then, to kick us off, as I always do in this second series, perhaps you might define for us what you mean by capitalism.
It is simultaneously one of the greatest inventions of the human race and a major disaster. Capitalism in its purest form, in the textbook form, is, I think, quite unparalleled. A driver of productivity and innovation and creativity, the like of which we've never seen. The world's population has tripled in the roughly 50-odd years since I was born, but GDP has quintupled. And that's a range of factors, but capitalism plays a major role. At the same time, in its current incarnation, it's generating, let me call them side effects. We have massive environmental damage, and so far, we're unable to act against the looming challenge of climate change. The fruits of capitalism are not being equally distributed, particularly in the US and the UK. Most of the returns to the growth of the last 20 years have gone to the top 10, 50% of the population. People at the bottom, in many cases, have not seen their incomes increase, and in many ways have seen their lives get harder. And last but not least, the tensions caused by this increasing inequality are driving massive popular dissatisfaction with the existing set of government. And I'm saying this to you, and you're running a series on democracy.
But I think you're still dancing around the question. You've told me a lot about capitalism, but you haven't defined it as a concept. Do you think of it as a concept, as a platform, as an economic system?
So for me, it's the private ownership of property plus the genuine free and fair market. That's sort of textbook capitalism. There are, of course, many different varieties. There's state capitalism, China and some. There is what some people call high road capitalism, or deeply as you see in some parts of Europe and Japan. And then there's sort of purer capitalism in the US and the UK, with Canada and Australia sort of having intermediate positions. But all about private ownership plus competition.
The subtitle of your book is A World on Fire. And you're very specific about how and why our world is on fire. You talk about three specific areas. The first is the imminent and perhaps current environmental catastrophe. The second is the inequality rife in the world today, from culture to economics. And the third focuses on the way in which many of our traditional 20th century institutions have lost their legitimacy in the early part of the 21st century. So perhaps you might address each of those three areas for us.
Let's start with climate catastrophe, because it's perhaps the clearest. When you give ability for results and high returns for making those results, they generate them. And if you have a capitalist system in which environmental externalities are not priced, firms will ignore them. So we've generated enormous prosperity and at the same time put the long-term viability of the stability of the world's climate in doubt. That's capitalism's fault in a way, but not really, right? What's really missing is appropriate regulation or controls on a massive externality, basic textbook economics, but our political system has been such that it's been very difficult to put those kinds of controls in place. Second problem, inequality. inequality in capitalism is a feature, not a bug, right? One of the reasons we think it works is that people work super hard and they do really well. And I don't grudge entrepreneurs hundreds of millions of dollars if they create enormous social value. Two problems. One is if trickles down to people at the bottom. And if most of the money is concentrated at the top, that's going to cause major political imbalances. So we now have 600 billionaires in the US, and we know that if they pick up the phone, any politician will answer. Even with the best will in the world, even if they're all fabulous people who want the best for our republic, that makes me super nervous. And the other problem is that we're losing social mobility and economic equality of opportunity, or even roughly plausible freedom of opportunity. When people say that capitalism generates prosperity and freedom, I'm like, yes, but if the prosperity isn't shared, and if the freedom is only for people who are lucky enough to be born in the right zip code to the right parents, if most people can't participate, that's a serious problem. So it's not inequality per se that worries me. Some degree of it, I think, is healthy. It's this extreme inequality coupled with the basic slowing down of the escalator that might bring people out of many disadvantaged places to be able to participate. That's, I think, the issue with inequality. As far as institutions go, so in 3 minutes, I think free markets need to be balanced by free politics. I'm an old-fashioned political liberal in the 18th century sense. I'm all about balance of power. That the free market is amazing, but if it gets too much power, if it's able to set its own rules, that's almost an oxymoron, right? If the fastest way to make shareholder value is to capture the legislature so that you get the rules in your own favor, that's not really capitalism. That's something else. And so for me, a healthy society is, yes, the free market, but balanced by a strong, capable, democratically elected government. And in turn, a third sector, strong media, some kind of voice for employees. And I think of a strong society not as everyone holding hands and singing Kumbaya, but as a group that has some sense of its shared destiny. That, you know, if we don't get together, we're going to hang separately. That we really need each other to build a system that grows prosperity. And, you know, you've had amazing experts on this show, but my sense of the work in history and political economy is that successful human societies have found a way to kind of bootstrap. Let's get the government better. Let's try the market. Let's get the government better. Let's try the market. Whoa, we need to protect employees. Whoa, we need to think about environmental extension. And, you know, Professor Acemoglu, Duran Acemoglu, calls this the narrow gate, right? How do we get through that gate so we get that reinforcing dynamic? Because, and I feel this every day, the risk is we tip off into what he calls extraction, that a few people grab all the political and economic power for themselves, and that's in the long run bad for them and their children, and it's sure as heck not good for the rest of us. So that's how I think about that third problem. And I'm sorry, a long answer. Right now, we are badly out of balance. The free market has sort of moved into such a central position. The rhetoric, particularly in the US, but in other parts of the world, has become so strongly, government is the problem, let's get rid of government, that we have effectively sort of crippled important parts of government. I mean, can I get topical and talk about COVID? But the spectacle of the states bidding against each other for vital medical equipment in the midst of a national emergency, I mean, I'm there with the free market, but that is crazy. Why don't we have some centralized planning? What's happened to our government that we're so suspicious that government could do anything that we sort of run it down so it doesn't work. And of course, we could talk about the history of that idea and where it comes from. But right now, the effect is our society is radically split. These major public goods problems, environment and inequality, that need to be addressed through government and political action cannot be. So I end up writing this book with the truly bizarre thesis that business should step up and grapple with these public goods problems. And I'm not saying that because like business can do everything and that's ideal. I'm saying that because I think our political process is so broken.
Rebecca, before we get on to fixing capitalism, and of course then democracy as well, perhaps you might explain how and why these three areas, from inequality to the institutional crisis to our environmental catastrophe, how these are undermining democracy in the early part of the 21st century.
I think it's a cause. I think the political crisis started some time ago. The political crisis started when a significant fraction of the population came to believe that winning at any cost was worth it. And effectively, faced with the choice of do we care about the institutions or do we care about winning, chose winning. And I understand that some part of that coalition, and this is why it's chicken and egg, and you're right, of course, you made me choose, but it is both, is some people feel their whole way of life is coming unstuck. That, nuts to democracy if it essentially is attacking my way of life. I might disagree with them as to what is attacking their way of life, but people who are desperate, people who feel the system has failed them, will look around for people to blame.
So we've got this three-pronged crisis, Rebecca: the crisis of the environment, the crisis of inequality, and an institutional legitimacy crisis. And on top of that, of course, we have the coronavirus crisis. So what are we going to do about it? In your book, Reimagining Capitalism, rather than relying on government, you seem to suggest that one of the solutions, perhaps the central solution to the way in which the world is on fire today, is fixing it through corporations.
That is absolutely what I say. I published a piece on the Harvard Business Review website, the big idea for the months of, alas, March and April, why business needs to fix democracy, the worst timing of any article ever, but why business needs to fix democracy. Let me be super clear, Andrew. This is not my first solution. Business school role, and you say, Rebecca, what's the best way to fix democracy? I say, could we have a massive political and social movement, please? Could we have citizen engagement? Could we have a renewal of civics? Could we rediscover democracy? And sometimes when my students come to me and say, how should I spend my life? I say, had you thought of being an activist? That feels to me like the high leverage right now. So I just want to go on record as not suggesting that business is the answer or the only answer. What I'm suggesting is right now, that massive political and social movement doesn't look as though it's showing up. Even if it is showing up, it could use allies. And right now, business is facing a strong business case, an economic imperative to act against these problems. Now, it's a collective case. We can come back to that. But, if I ran the world, well, no better. How about you, Andrew? I've just made you CEO of the entire world, okay? You own everything. For you, now this is important, for you, climate change is not an externality. For you, inequality and political craziness is not an externality. It's a fundamental threat to your long-term returns. And that's the underlying business case here.
I hope I'm getting this right, Rebecca, but you seem to suggest that this is a $12 trillion opportunity, this crisis, for corporations, not only to fix capitalism and democracy, but actually to make themselves more profitable ventures.
That's the positive opportunity. We're not talking about the side benefit of not having the climate destabilize and hundreds of millions of people migrate and political breakdown or deep dysfunction in all the major democracies. No, there's huge upside there. Seriously, burning fossil fuels cost between 2 and 6% of US GDP every year, just in health costs right now. Upside, let's talk about upside. If the world is going to shift, and it must shift, employees and customers are going to demand different kinds of products and services. And so one of the things I talk about in my book is the very real business cases. That is, individual firms are making billions of dollars right now beginning to tackle these problems. It's not enough to save things and restore democracy, but it's real money and it's right here. And it creates a group of businesses who have strong incentives to see strong government and real democracy. That's why I think this is so important, is if we can persuade a significant fraction of business to begin moving in this direction, it becomes self-reinforcing. Because if you build a business model based on the premise that there's going to be carbon regulation, or you build it on cleaning up your supply chain and raising wages because your consumers insist, you have a strong economic interest in making sure that people who play dirty are no longer able to compete. You have an interest to advocate for regulation. You have an interest in advocating for stronger government. So it's not like this is the answer. It's, as we think about how to rebuild democracy, I believe business could be a super important ally.
So you're not really arguing that we need to rethink capitalism. Perhaps you're suggesting that capitalists need to rethink capitalism.
Luigi Zingales, who I'm sure you're going to talk to if you haven't already.
Yes, we were the Chicago Business School.
He has a wonderful book called Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. And I was on a podcast a little while ago, and the interviewer looked at me and said, Rebecca, you're not really talking about reimagining capitalism, are you? You're talking about, could we please go back to the balanced capitalism of the 60s, only without the racism and the misogyny, please?
Mm.
No, that's exactly right. What's new in my book is not where I'm trying to get to. I'm I hate to say this, but I'd like to get to Denmark. I really would.
I remember one of those great debates between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton from 2016, in which Bernie was going on and on about something in Denmark, and Hillary turned around and said, Bernie, that's all very well, and I love Denmark as much as anybody, but we can't all be Denmark. Are you saying that we can indeed be Denmark? I think Denmark is one of the 3 models in your book. You also include Mauritius and Germany. Are you saying that even America can become like Denmark?
I think we were Denmark. I think in the 50s and 60s, we were surprisingly close to Denmark. As we were coming out of World War II, labor unions were quite strong, so there was a strong voice for employees at the table. There was huge respect for government. There was strong regulation. It's Republican presidents who passed the major pieces of legislation we still rely on today. It's not a crazy place to get to.
Rebecca, you teach the best and brightest at Harvard Business School. It's the top business school in the country, and it seems to attract the smartest Americans. Is that part of our problem, that smart Americans go into corporations, they want to make money, their goal is to go to Harvard Business School, and meanwhile, the government isn't getting the smartest Americans? Do we need to rethink the nature of our universities and indeed our culture, so that the best and brightest, rather than choosing going to business school, go into government itself, go into government service?
Well, it's part of the way in which our society is radically out of balance. Is, as you say, the sort of smart, ambitious people, even the people who want to make a difference, very few of them consider political or government careers. Part of that's because as a society, we've significantly devalued government. We've either taken it for granted, I vote every 4 years, they'll do it, but we haven't thought of it as something that has to be nurtured and grown. Our conversation has become too much, I think, about me and now. and not enough about us and later. And if you think of all the great faith traditions, they all say that's a mistake. And our whole society has sort of lost that sense of us and later. And so, yes, that's why I say to some of my students, had you thought of going into government or into politics, that might be the place you can make the most difference.
The subtitle of your book is A World on Fire. You've got teenage kids, or I think you have a son at college. I've got kids both at college and teenagers about to go off to college. What happens if we don't put out this fire? What will this mean for future generations if we're not able to reimagine capitalism, fix inequality, fix democracy?
Deeply polarized society. A climate that is destabilizing. I say that, what do I mean? I mean the fires in California and Australia we saw last year, much more like that. Whole regions of the earth becoming uninhabitable. Climate change will be like the pandemic. It will change everything, but there is no vaccine. We have to stop it before it gets here. And if we don't address inequality, we not only leave hundreds of millions of people in suffering, but we create the very political anger that makes it impossible to fix the long-term problems that we have. I can get really bleak really fast. I mean, I read the climate science for a living, and it's not fun. It's really serious. I do want to close, though, on a tiny note of hope. And I say hope, I'm not optimistic. It's not like oh yeah, we're going to fix this. 5 easy steps, we're done. I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a moment. It's clearly not the case. I think we're in a very dark place, that the pandemic raises the risk that we will do nothing. We will come out of this poorer and angrier and not make progress. But we have the technology and resources to fix these problems. We are rich enough to address the problem of inequality, to address the environmental problems we have. We can see that we can do it. So I continue to hope that we're smart enough to do the right thing. We know what that is. It's not that expensive. Let's go do it.